They thought it was just an old mirror, bolted to the wall of a dusty farmhouse no one had lived in for years. But when this single mom removed it, she uncovered something life-changing, a hidden vault, sealed for decades, holding an inheritance worth $17 million. What began as a fresh start for one single mom became a journey into family secrets, courage, and a second chance that would change everything. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe for more powerful stories like this and drop a comment letting us know where you're watching from. Her name was Elsie, a 34-year-old single mother juggling 2 part-time jobs while raising her 8-year-old son. Mason, in a cramped apartment on the outskirts of Cincinnati. Life hadn't been kind. After a painful divorce 3 years prior, she had barely managed to keep herself afloat. Losing her mother to cancer shortly after only added to the weight. And then came the quiet passing of her grandmother, the family's last matriarch, at the age of 97. When a letter from a local notary arrived, Elsie nearly tossed it, assuming it was another late payment notice. But something about the thick, cream-colored envelope made her pause. Her name was written in a delicate cursive, a style she hadn't seen since she was a child. Her grandmother's hand. Inside, she found a legal notice she had inherited her grandmother's old farmhouse, tucked away in the forgotten hills of Kentucky. It was a place she hadn't seen in nearly 2 decades. She remembered only pieces: the quiet creak of floorboards, the lavender scent in every room, and one door that always remained shut. Her grandmother's bedroom. With keys in hand and a fragile sense of hope, Elsie packed up Mason and drove south, not seeking fortune, just a fresh start. It was just after noon when Elsie and Mason pulled up the winding gravel path. The farmhouse rose slowly into view, a silhouette against the Kentucky hills that hadn't changed much since she was a child. The wraparound porch sagged in places, and ivy curled up the chipped white siding like fingers refusing to let go. Yet, despite its weathered state, the place held a certain dignity, like an old woman who still wore her favorite necklace even when the world had moved on. Mason peered through the window, eyes wide. Is this where Grandma lived? Elsie smiled faintly. Yeah, baby. A long time ago. They stepped inside, the scent of dust and time wrapping around them like an old blanket. The floorboards groaned under their feet. Sunlight filtered through sheer curtains, casting golden stripes across furniture covered in white sheets. The house had been untouched since her grandmother passed, maybe even before that. She wandered through the rooms, her fingers tracing the familiar corners of her memory. There was the grandfather clock that hadn't ticked in years, the piano missing 2 ivory keys, the faded photograph of her grandparents on their wedding day, still sitting on the mantel. And then the room. Her grandmother's bedroom. The door didn't creak as she opened it. It swung inward like it had been waiting. The room was smaller than she remembered, but the feeling was the same: quiet, sacred, and full of secrets. The bed was neatly made. The lace doilies still rested beneath the old ceramic lamp. The air smelled faintly of lavender and cedarwood, just like it used to. But it was the mirror that stopped her. Tall and wide, it stood above the antique dresser, its frame carved with delicate floral patterns that twisted like vines. Elsie had seen it 1,000 times, but something about it now felt off. The glass was too clean, too still, almost like it was watching. Mason tugged at her sleeve. Mom, why is it nailed to the wall? Elsie blinked. He was right. The mirror wasn't resting. It was bolted into place with large, rusted screws. Her grandmother had never liked change. But bolting a mirror to the wall, she leaned in, trying to peer behind it. Dust lined the edges, thick and undisturbed. She felt an urge rise in her chest. Not fear, not quite, but a tug of intuition. A whisper from somewhere deep, telling her this wasn't just a mirror. That night, after Mason had fallen asleep on the living room couch, Elsie returned to the room with a flashlight and a screwdriver. One by one, the screws came loose. Each groaned in protest, as if resisting her touch. With a final twist, the last bolt gave way, and she slowly tilted the mirror forward. It was heavier than she expected, but she managed to lower it gently to the floor. What she saw behind it stole the breath from her lungs. Instead of bare wall, there was a wooden panel, slightly cracked at the edges. In the center, a faint outline rectangular, small, and uneven. A hidden door. Her hands trembled as she pressed against it. Click! The panel gave way with a soft pop, revealing a shallow, dust-filled recess. Inside was a single iron box, no larger than a suitcase. It had a brass latch and a faded velvet lining, dark with time. For a moment, Elsie hesitated, afraid of what she might find. Then she opened it. Inside were bundles of papers, yellowed envelopes, and velvet pouches filled with what looked like and truly were jewels. Real ones, diamonds, emeralds, antique rings and brooches that glinted under her flashlight like stars pulled from the dark. And beneath it all, in a sealed folder, were legal documents, property deeds, stock certificates, even rare bearer bonds. She flipped through them, her hands shaking. Some were dated nearly a century ago. Others, more recent. One had a bank's letterhead and the words estimated value of combined assets $17,200 $60,000. She couldn't breathe. Elsie sat on the edge of the bed, the folder open on her lap, her heart thundering in her chest. She wasn't a woman who cried easily, not after what life had thrown at her. But in that moment, the tears came freely. Not because of the money, but because her grandmother had left it for her. Quietly, secretly, intentionally. All those years. Elsie had believed her grandmother had nothing left, that she'd lived a modest life with little to her name. But now, sitting there in that small room, she realized her grandmother hadn't just left her a house. She'd left her a future, a legacy built not on wealth, but on faith in Elsie to find it. Down the hallway, Mason stirred in his sleep. She gently closed the box, wiped her face, and whispered, "Thank you," because somehow, even from beyond the grave, her grandmother had known one day Elsie would need this. And when that day came, she'd be strong enough to open the door. The next morning, the world outside felt different, not in the way the trees swayed or the birds sang, but in the way Elsie carried herself. Her steps felt lighter, her heart, still racing from the night before, now beat with something she hadn't felt in a long time possibility. She had barely slept. The contents of that iron box had occupied every thought, the jewels, the bonds, the letters, the value. But more than that, the realization that her grandmother had trusted her with something so monumental. Still, there was much she didn't understand. Why hide it? Why never mention it? And what was she supposed to do now? Elsie brewed a pot of coffee in the old, humming kitchen and sat at the table flipping through the documents again. Some of the bonds were from companies she didn't even recognize. The letters, many addressed to law firms, private banks, and trust offices, were written in her grandmother's neat, meticulous hand. There were also clippings of newspaper articles from decades ago, some circled in red ink, headlines about real estate, government auctions, company acquisitions, and a name that appeared over and over again. Evelyn Durham. Elsie froze. That was her grandmother's maiden name. She flipped to one of the articles. The headline read, E.D. Acquires historic textile mill estate in silent auction. It dawned on her grandmother had been investing wisely, secretly, and very successfully. But something didn't sit right. As the morning sun rose higher, Elsie made a decision. She needed help. Not just legal help answers. So she did something she hadn't done in years. She called her great-uncle Leo, the only remaining sibling of her grandmother. "Leo, it's Elsie. I found something at the farmhouse. Do you have time to talk?" There was a long pause on the other end. Then, a sigh. I was wondering when this call would come. Leo lived 2 towns over. Within a few hours. He arrived slower now, leaning heavily on a cane, but his eyes still sharp as glass. He sat across from Elsie at the kitchen table, looking at the iron box and then at her. "She told me she was leaving it for you," he said softly. Elsie blinked. "You knew about it." "I didn't know where she hid it, but I knew she had made preparations. She trusted you more than anyone." "Why, though? Why all this? Why didn't she just leave it in a bank?" Leo smiled, but it was tinged with sadness. Because Evelyn didn't trust banks. Not after what happened to our family when we were young. He went on to explain that during the Great Depression, their parents had lost everything: savings, home, dignity, all because a local bank had gambled their money away. Evelyn had vowed never to put her trust in anyone else's hands again. So she began building, piece by piece, in private, real estate, investments, antique jewelry passed down through generations, all hidden, all protected. She said one day, someone would come along who needed it more than anyone else. Leo said, "She believed that someone was you." Elsie wiped her eyes. "She was right," she whispered. But Leo's face grew more serious. "There's something else you need to know." He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out an old photograph. It was faded, but Elsie recognized the house in the background, this house, and in the foreground. 2 men, one of whom looked vaguely familiar. Behind them stood Evelyn, stern-faced, her arms crossed. "That man on the left," Leo said, tapping the image. "His name is Frank Alcott. He used to be a lawyer, helped Evelyn with all her legal holdings." Used to be. He turned on her, tried to manipulate documents, forge a power of attorney. She caught him before he could do anything permanent. But it got messy. Elsie stared at the photo. "Is he still alive?" Leo nodded grimly. "Still lives in this town. Runs a shady real estate operation. If he catches wind that Evelyn's assets have surfaced again, he won't walk away quietly." Suddenly, the weight of what she'd found shifted. This wasn't just a gift anymore. It was a target. That evening, after Leo had left, Elsie checked on Mason and tucked him in early. The wind had picked up outside. The trees whispered against the windows. And for the first time since she arrived, she noticed something that made her heart skip a beat. The gate at the end of the gravel drive, the one she had locked that morning, now hung slightly open. She stepped out onto the porch, scanning the darkened landscape. Nothing, but a feeling crawled up her spine, cold and certain. Someone had been there. She returned inside and locked every door and window. She even slid the mirror, the same one she had removed, across the bedroom floor to block the doorway. Later, as she lay in bed staring at the ceiling, Elsie whispered into the dark, "Whatever you left me, Grandma, I'll protect it. I promise." But deep down, she already knew. The past wasn't finished with her yet. The morning after the gate incident, Elsie woke up with a knot in her stomach, the kind you couldn't explain. Only feel like the air was too still, like something invisible had shifted overnight. The farmhouse looked the same. The floor still creaked, the coffee pot still sputtered, and Mason was still curled up under the same patchwork quilt. But Elsie wasn't the same. She could no longer see the house as just an old family heirloom. It was something far more complex, a vault of history, a hiding place, and now a beacon. She didn't know who had come to the gate last night, but she knew why the secret was no longer safe. As she sipped her coffee at the kitchen table, she found herself staring at the box again. What had once felt like a miracle now sat like a ticking clock. The jewels, the documents, the photos. The weight of it all was pressing down on her chest, and something in her gut told her she had to read everything. That day, while Mason played in the yard with a stick and a pile of leaves, Elsie returned to the bedroom and began going through her grandmother's letters one by one. Some were simple inquiries to lawyers, copies of deeds, but one bundle, tied in blue ribbon and tucked beneath a velvet pouch, stopped her cold. They were written to her, letters her grandmother had written, but never sent. Dear Elsie, if you're reading this, it means the time has come. I wish I could have told you in person, but some things are better left to be discovered when the soul is ready. Tears welled up in her eyes. You've always been stronger than you know. Life hasn't been fair to you. I've watched that from a distance, but I also saw the light in you, the way you never gave up, the way you loved Mason even when you had nothing left for yourself. Elsie clutched the pages to her chest. It was as if her grandmother had known every storm she'd been through, every night spent crying quietly so Mason wouldn't hear, every bill she had to ignore just to put food on the table. And still, Evelyn had seen her as worthy. That moment cracked something open inside her. She realized the inheritance wasn't just money. It was a message, a declaration that her life wasn't meant to be just about surviving, that she was part of something bigger, that she had value, even when the world had tried to convince her otherwise. Later that afternoon, Elsie sat on the front porch, her eyes following Mason as he chased a butterfly across the grass. She saw herself in him curious, joyful, full of potential not yet shaped by hardship. And for the first time in years, she allowed herself to dream. What if she didn't sell the house? What if, instead of hiding this treasure or cashing it in all at once, she used it the way her grandmother had to build, to heal, to empower? Maybe she could fix the roof, start a business, fund a scholarship in Evelyn's name, create a legacy that stretched forward, not just back. But just as hope began to rise, the rumble of tires pulled her thoughts back down. A black sedan crawled up the drive, slow and deliberate. Her heart dropped. She stood and called out to Mason, who immediately ran to her side. The car came to a stop just 10 feet from the porch. The engine idled. The windows were tinted. A man stepped out tall, dressed in a dark overcoat, silver hair, and a sharp jawline. He didn't smile. "Mrs. Brooks?" he asked. Elsie tightened her grip on Mason's hand. "Who's asking?" The man reached into his coat and pulled out a card. Frank Alcott, private real estate consultant. Her blood ran cold. "I believe you've come into possession of property that may be connected to a number of unresolved legal interests," he said smoothly. "I'd like to discuss that with you." "Privately?" "I don't think that's necessary," Elsie replied, voice tight. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I assure you, Mrs. Brooks, it is—" She felt Mason press closer to her. "Not now," she thought. "Not here." "Please leave," she said, louder now. "This is private property." The man hesitated, then nodded slowly. "Of course. But I'll be in touch." He climbed back into the car, and the sedan rolled away too slowly. Elsie's legs shook beneath her. The fear had returned. But it wasn't the same as before. This time, it wasn't paralyzing. This time, it lit a fire. That night, as Mason slept, and the stars blinked above the old farmhouse. Elsie sat at the table, writing in her own notebook. not out of fear but out of strategy. She wrote down everything she'd learned. Every name, every document, every interaction. If her grandmother could protect this legacy in silence for decades, then so could she, but not alone. She opened her laptop and searched for lawyers, investigative journalists, financial advisors, not to sell, not to run, but to prepare. The mirror may have come down, but the reflection it left behind was this. Elsie was no longer just surviving. She was standing in a story bigger than her own. And now, she had a choice. Not to retreat, but to rise. The next week moved like slow thunder, quiet, steady, but full of tension beneath the surface. Every morning, Elsie woke with a purpose she hadn't felt in years. While Mason worked on his coloring books or explored the edges of the overgrown garden, she buried herself in documents, articles, and legal emails. The farmhouse had become her office, her war room, her sanctuary. But she wasn't hiding anymore. She was planning. Her first move was to meet with a lawyer in Lexington, one recommended by Leo. The man, Daniel Greer, was in his 60s, spoke with a calm southern drawl, and had the kind of eyes that made you feel like you were safe. She brought only copies, never the originals, and as she laid them on the polished oak table in his office, he let out a low whistle. "You're sitting on a financial landmine," he muttered. "Some of these assets haven't been touched in decades. And these bearer bonds, they're practically extinct. You realize how rare it is to find something like this intact, unclaimed, and untainted." "I do now," Elsie said. Daniel leaned back in his chair. "This kind of wealth doesn't just attract curiosity, it attracts sharks." Elsie nodded. "One already came to my door." Back at the farmhouse, Elsie continued her grandmother's quiet diligence. She organized everything into locked boxes. She had backups stored at Leo's place, encrypted digital scans, and a notebook filled with personal observations. She even installed new locks on the front and back doors, and made sure Mason knew not to open for strangers. But amid the pressure, something unexpected began to grow a sense of power. One afternoon, as Elsie stood by the window watching Mason build a tiny fort out of twigs, she felt it the shift. The woman who'd walked into this house just a few weeks ago had been scared, tired, and unsure of her worth. But this version of her, she was focused. She was becoming someone else. Her grandmother had seen this in her all along. That evening, as she flipped through a stack of Evelyn's old letters, she found something that felt like a sign. "If this money ever reaches you, don't let it end with you. Turn it into something. Not just for yourself, but for those who never had a chance." Elsie stared at the words, her throat tightening. Her grandmother hadn't just been wealthy, she'd been intentional. Evelyn had started buying property in depressed areas of town, long before gentrification was a word on anyone's lips. She had quietly donated to orphanages, scholarships, food banks, all anonymously, and the documents suggested there was more, a trust that had never been activated. Its beneficiary line was blank. Elsie picked up a pen, and she wrote one word, Mason. The idea came late one night, like most good things do. What if she restored the farmhouse, not just to sell, but to preserve? What if it became a shelter for single mothers like her, a temporary home, a place where women could regroup, recover, and rise again? She could use a portion of the inheritance to set it up, fund it anonymously under Evelyn's name, and maybe turn this place of quiet secrets into a place of second chances. The idea terrified her. She wasn't a businesswoman. She had no experience running a nonprofit, but something deeper than fear spoke louder. Purpose. She could do this not all at once, not alone, but she could take the first step. 3 weeks later, the renovations began. The roof was repaired first. Then the plumbing. New paint peeled back decades of tired walls. Every hammer strike echoed like a heartbeat through the house, like it was waking up after a long sleep. Leo came by often, sometimes just to sit on the porch and sip sweet tea while Mason ran barefoot through the grass. "You know," he said one day, "I always thought this house was a place where time stood still, but it looks different now." Elsie smiled. "It's not stuck anymore. It's moving forward." She hired a small team, mostly women, many of them single mothers themselves. She wanted them to be part of the transformation, not just of the house, but of their own stories. And little by little, the place became something new. The final touch came when she placed her grandmother's mirror, now cleaned and restored, on the wall opposite the one it had once hidden. This time, it reflected light. It reflected growth. It reflected truth. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the fields glowed gold, Elsie walked the hallway in silence. She paused before the mirror, gazing into her own eyes, tired. Yes, but clear, strong. She placed her hand gently against the glass and whispered, "You were right, Grandma." And somewhere, somehow, she felt the warmth of a woman who had once carried the weight of the world, now passing it on. Not as a burden, but as a torch. There were still nights when Elsie lay awake, listening to the wind rustle through the Kentucky trees, wondering if she was in over her head. The farmhouse, though transformed, still creaked like an old soul talking in its sleep. Some corners still held shadows, memories that whispered of Evelyn's long silence. But something inside Elsie had shifted slowly. Then, all at once, she was no longer just trying to survive. She was choosing to become. Each day brought new challenges, calls with lawyers, meetings with contractors, paperwork stacked on the old kitchen table, fundraising pitches, logistics for launching the shelter she had envisioned. There were mistakes, setbacks, even moments of panic when it felt like the entire plan might fall apart. But where she once would have curled inward and backed away, now she stood taller. She asked questions. She fought for clarity. She took up space. And for the first time in her life, people listened. One afternoon, during a break in the renovation, Elsie drove into town with Mason. It was just a routine grocery trip until she overheard a young woman at the checkout line arguing with a clerk. She had 2 toddlers with her, a grocery cart half full, and a debit card that kept getting declined. Elsie didn't think, she acted. "I've got it," she said softly, tapping her card. The woman stared at her, eyes wide with a blend of gratitude and shame. "You don't have to." "I know," Elsie replied, "but I want to." As the woman rolled her cart out into the sunlight, Elsie felt a strange ache rise in her chest. It wasn't sadness. It was recognition. That had been her, not so long ago. The feeling of standing in a checkout line, trying not to cry, praying that the machine would beep green instead of red. That moment lit something even deeper inside her. It wasn't enough to build the shelter. She had to fill it with hope. Back at the farmhouse, progress continued. The old living room became a gathering space, couches donated by local churches, bookshelves lined with Evelyn's dusty but beloved novels. The guest rooms upstairs were painted in soft earth tones, fresh linens, handmade quilts from Leo's church group, a small playroom for children. The shelter didn't have a name until Mason asked the question one night over dinner. "Mom, what are you going to call it?" Elsie smiled, looking out the window toward the glowing fields. "The Evelyn house," she whispered. When word got out, the town's reaction was mixed. Some praised her courage. Some whispered behind her back. A few asked uncomfortable questions about how a single mom suddenly had the money to fund all this. She answered with honesty and boundaries. "I inherited something," she would say. "But what I choose to do with it, that's my story now." And it was soon. The Evelyn house welcomed its first resident, a young mother named Danielle, fleeing an abusive relationship with nothing but a backpack and her 4-year-old son. Elsie greeted her at the door with a warm smile, a hot meal, and clean sheets. Danielle cried the first night. The second night, she laughed. By the end of the first week, she was helping Mason build a fort out of couch cushions and cardboard boxes. Elsie watched from the doorway, heart full. This was what her grandmother had seen. Not just the hidden wealth, but the hidden strength in passing it forward. One evening, Elsie found herself alone in Evelyn's old room. The mirror was back on the wall, not hiding anything this time, but reflecting the truth. She stood before it, really looking at herself. Not just the tired eyes, or the faint lines at the corners of her mouth, but the way her shoulders no longer sagged, the way her gaze didn't flinch. She was still a single mother, still rebuilding, but she was no longer the woman who arrived at this house, lost and uncertain. She was a builder, a protector, a storyteller. And in that reflection, she saw Evelyn too, not behind her, but beside her. Not a ghost, but a guide. Weeks later, during the soft launch of the shelter, Elsie stood in front of a small crowd, friends, supporters, volunteers, her voice trembling but clear. "I came back to this house hoping to find peace." She began. "What I found was a door not just behind a mirror, but inside myself. My grandmother left me more than a home. She left me the belief that no matter how broken the past, we can build something beautiful from it." Applause followed, some tears too. But what mattered most to Elsie wasn't the approval. It was the feeling in her chest that she had done something right. Not perfect, not easy, but good. True. The first snowfall came early that year. Flakes danced over the hills like tiny messengers, softening the edges of the world, blanketing the porch of the Evelyn house in pure white. Inside, laughter echoed through the old farmhouse. Mason and the other kids had turned the hallway into a racetrack, sliding across the floor in socks, giggling until they collapsed into a pile of pillows. Elsie stood at the window, a cup of tea warming her hands. She smiled not just at the moment in front of her, but at the journey behind her. From the second she had opened that mirror, her life had been moving toward this, not toward riches, not toward recognition, but toward purpose. Her phone buzzed gently on the table. A new message from the city's housing department. Another young mother had been approved to move in, the third in a month. Each one a story of resilience, heartbreak, and quiet courage. Elsie replied with a simple, "We'll have a room ready." That night, after the kids had fallen asleep and the house had quieted into that familiar nighttime hush, Elsie wandered into Evelyn's old bedroom. The mirror was still there, not bolted, not hiding. She looked at her reflection. Really looked. A woman with tired eyes and laugh lines, a mother, a founder, a survivor. And for the first time in her life, she didn't wish to be anyone else. She touched the edge of the mirror, remembering the night it all began, the weight of the glass, the surprise of the hidden latch, the way her breath had caught in her throat when she saw the box behind it. But more than any of that, she remembered the feeling, that electric hum in her bones that whispered, "This is bigger than you." And it had been so much bigger. In the following months, the shelter grew into something alive. A community garden bloomed out back in the spring. Volunteers arrived from nearby churches and colleges. A local carpenter offered to build a small playground. Every little piece added another layer, another branch in a tree Evelyn had planted long ago. One day a letter arrived, handwritten, no return address, My daughter stayed at your shelter last month. She came to you broken. You gave her back her dignity. Thank you for saving her. Thank you for honoring women like my mother." Elsie cried when she read it. Not just for the words, but because it confirmed what she had always believed deep down. Every act of compassion echoes longer than we know. Later that summer, Elsie held a small dedication in the garden. It wasn't flashy. Just a few chairs, iced tea, wildflowers from the field. She stood beneath the old oak tree where Mason had built a swing, surrounded by the people who had helped bring the house back to life. Leo sat in the front row, eyes glistening. Danielle, the shelter's first resident, now worked full-time as the program coordinator. A group of women, once strangers, now sisters, gathered around a wooden sign engraved with gold lettering. The Evelyn House, for every woman who had to start over and did. Elsie stepped up to the podium, holding a small note card. But when she looked out at the crowd, she realized she didn't need it. Some stories begin with love. Some begin with loss. Mine began with both, she said softly. When I removed that mirror, I thought I was uncovering a secret. But what I found wasn't hidden treasure. It was a doorway. She paused. A doorway to healing, to legacy, to a future that didn't have to look like the past. The wind stirred through the trees. I'm just one woman, a mom who struggled to believe she mattered. But my grandmother believed. And now, I do too. Applause rose like a quiet wave, not loud, but full of soul. That night, Elsie tucked Mason into bed in their upstairs room. "Mom," he whispered. "Yeah, baby? Do you think Grandma Evelyn sees what we did?" Elsie smiled, brushing the hair from his forehead. "I think she's been watching all along." And as she turned off the light, she looked once more at the mirror on the hallway wall. Its reflection caught her and Mason together, two figures wrapped in a story far larger than either of them had imagined. Not everyone gets a second chance. Not everyone finds a door behind the mirror. But Elsie did. And when she stepped through, she didn't just change her life, she opened that door for others. Sometimes, what we believe to be the end of the road is simply a door hidden, quiet, waiting for us to be brave enough to open it. Elsie's story reminds us that the greatest gifts in life are not always wrapped in riches, but in faith. Faith that we are stronger than our past, wiser than our wounds, and capable of building something beautiful from the broken pieces. Her grandmother didn't just leave her money. She left her a choice. And Elsie, despite the fear, chose to act not just for herself, but for others like her. Women who had been forgotten, mothers who had been judged, survivors who had been silenced. When we carry the pain of our past into the future with purpose, it becomes more than pain. It becomes power. If this story moved you, hit subscribe. More true stories are coming. And if you believe in second chances, share this with someone who needs one. Sometimes, all it takes is what's waiting behind the mirror.